So good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this wonderful meeting of minds, I would like to say, but our presenter and our kind of interviewee is going to be doing the majority of the talking. I just get to pull it out of him. Again, just thank you so much for being here, and I get the wonderful privilege of introducing our guest and our star for this evening. He has a bio there, but I'm not necessarily interested in saying anything about what his accomplishments are and things. You can read those for yourself, but I want to kind of speak from my heart as far as what specifically and why, what he means to me specifically in the form of an introduction. I met our presenter this summer as we were both kind of transitioning into the city of Macomb as our inaugural CT Vivian scholars. Shout out to Brenda, also one of our fellow scholars who is here tonight this evening. Thank you for being here. But when I met this guy for the very first time, I was just like, yeah, who is this guy? He talks. But as I listened to the things that he says, I was just like, you know what? This guy has a point of view. He listens. And he really wants to know and really wants to understand life and how we do things. I found one thing as I was preparing for this particular event. I found one really thing that is very interesting about our presenter, and that interesting fact is actually his name. Sorry, I have to pull my little cue card here so I can remind myself. It says his name actually means, I don't care what people say, let them talk. His name actually means that. And so I want to present to some and introduce to others a person who I truly consider a confidant and friend, the soon-to-be Dr. Pechulano Ali.
Oh, boy. Oh. Thank you.
So, again, it's just, we're going to do our thing. I was telling someone earlier that I get to kind of have my Steve Harvey live my Steve Harvey fantasy. So I'm really excited to kind of sit up here and interview. But Pechulano, we are so glad that you're here and that you wanted to take the opportunity to share with us and to viewers and individuals who will see this a bit piece about yourself and who you are, what you do, and what makes you exciting. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself, let people hear from you, tell them your name, anything you wish to tell them, and then we'll kind of get started. Is that okay?
Thank you so much, all. And I'm going to have to say this is quite a crowd. But, you know, I like to introduce myself as I don't care what people say. Oh, I guess you kind of like got the gist, but that's me, and it's Pechulano Ali. I'm Cameroonian. I like to say that I'm many things, but before any of those things that I may tell you today that I am, I see myself as a lover of stories and a teller of stories, regardless of the shades in which they are. Stories of anguish, of love, of community. Those are the kinds of stories that I like to tell, and over time, those stories have defined me more than anything that you may read in, you know, that leaflet that's outside on the table, or more than anything that I will tell you here today, and it's just going to be an inch of the kinds of stories that I like to tell. So I don't want to tell you that I am going to be president someday. I just want to tell you that I love stories, and I'm here to tell you a story. I hope you can listen and learn something.
Awesome, beautiful. All right, so to get us going, and this particular question will, I think, encapsulate a whole lot of things, but take us back to the beginning, as early as you can remember, and kind of give us a chronological kind of picture of your life as it relates to back home in Cameroon, what things were like. I mean, bring us into your mother's kitchen, almost, up until to the time you came to the United States to study up until this moment. So that should definitely give us some time here. So
and I have to laugh because you mentioned my mother's kitchen. As I was preparing to come here this evening, I was on the phone with her, and I said, "Can you imagine? They've organized this talk on campus, and I have to go talk to people. They said I have to tell them my story." He's like, "Oh, maybe you should have told me earlier, so I tell you one of my recipes that would give you sort of like, inspiration, because I love my mother, and I should tell you, she says hi to everyone who's here today, because if she were here, I told her it's only going to be 1 hour, and she says, oh my God, what are you going to be talking for 1 hour? If she was here, we will not stop until next week. So before you say that I talk, wait until you meet my mother. But some of you may know that I am Cameroonian. And if you don't know where Cameroon is, if you're familiar with the map of Africa, think of that portion of the map that looks like an underarm. That's exactly where Cameroon is. And although geopolitically, people like to think that it's in Central Africa, I like to think that it's in West Africa. So if you ask me where's Cameroon, I'd say West and Central Africa. It's right next to Nigeria and Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Congo, Central African Republic, and Chad. So it's one of the, what I like to call the confused countries of Central Africa, because it doesn't know whether it was colonized by Britain or France, but it has that dual colonial history of being colonized by France and Britain at the same time. That's the reason I speak English. Because people ask me, how did you learn this? I'm like, yeah, it's my first language. I grew up speaking that, thanks to the British. But if you can see what's on here, I am not only from Cameroon, but I'm from what I like to call a special part of Cameroon, and that's what looks like the red part. I'm from a town called Bamenda. It's in the northwest part of the country, and it's one of the English-speaking regions of the country, because although it's a bilingual country, English is a minority. There's only 2 English-speaking regions, and I'm from one of those regions. We fondly call our town Abakwa, which means the town of love, or people like to think of the people who are from the grass field of Cameroon as people who are welcoming, people who like to boast about themselves, but also like to open their arms to people no matter where they are from. So I grew up in that town. I grew up in Bamenda, but I went to school in another, one of the other English-speaking regions of the country, Boyer, that's the southwest region. And on the other side, you may see that beautiful graphic of somewhat a wedding that's gone wrong. And that's because I'm from the part of Cameroon that is currently in turmoil right now because of its dual colonial history. There's fighting between the majority French government and the English-speaking regions, because right after independence, there's been these questions of, and don't worry, I'm not going to give you a history lesson. There's been this question of whether or not Anglophones are treated equally with Francophones. So America, I hear you. When we talk about diversity issues and issues of some groups of people not being treated well, I know it. I've been there. So that's home for me. But I've lived in almost all the 10 regions of the country, except 2 that I've not lived in, but I've been there. So there's 10 regions, and I've been to all the 8 regions. I've also been to a couple of countries on the continent with on my storytelling journey, working for different kinds of organizations, documenting the lives of people like me, or people whose stories often are not told in the mainstream media.
Awesome.
Oh, I think part of that question was from my mother's kitchen. Can you imagine? And I'm forgetting it. So I am the fourth boy of 5 boys. Yes. And my mother liked to say she has a kingdom. And I said, well, unfortunately, there's no queen. Then it's not a kingdom because we need a queen to have a kingdom. But all of my siblings are in Cameroon. They all live there with their families, and I'm here with this other family that I have found in America in different cities and now are in Macomb. But my life from my mother's kitchen to sitting here and talking to you guys today is, for those of you who are Christians and believe in miracles, I like to say it's a miracle, because when you grew up in a community of a lot of difficulty, I grew up in a very tiny community where access to education, for example, was considered a luxury for many. And if you did go to school, your parents would oblige you to become a medical doctor, to become a lawyer, or to become an engineer. And I, the fourth boy in 5, was, I would say, the luckiest one in my family to overcome some of those difficulties and go on to be here today and be talking to you. And so if I were to take you into my mother's kitchen, it'd probably be roasting corn and eating with peanuts. What you call peanuts here, we call groundnuts back home, and eating with peanuts, and she telling me, you are the light. Go on and keep shining. But for me, it's been a journey of, not only using the foundations of how I grew up to uplift people wherever I go, to tell the stories of people wherever I go, and to bring perspective wherever I find myself. It's also been a journey of sitting down, taking a step back, and listening to people. Because one thing I tell people when I talk to them is that for you to be a good storyteller, you need to be able to listen to people. You need to be able to understand that we are different, but we are one. And until I listen to you, I can't know how similar we are. And that's something that I learned a lot in my mother's kitchen, because I'm very different from my brothers. The way I talk, the way I do things, the way I think. And my mother would always tell me, I know that your way is your way, but sometimes you have to take a step back and listen to your brothers, because their ways too can't work. And that's what has been sort of a foundation for me. Wherever I have worked, in a newsroom, in organizations with communications, and now in the classroom, it's been a foundation for me. I think that talks a lot about going from my mother's kitchen to sitting here.
Sure.
Great.
Awesome. Beautiful. So Pechulano, where would you say in your kind of in your span as far as being in Cameroon, where did you find, what would you say is that that defining moment in your life that you knew that you wanted to tell stories, that you wanted to highlight the lives of people around you in your community and to bring it to the forefront? At what point in your life that would have led you to come to the United States to study? I mean, I know you got here, after you finished school in Cameroon, but help us with that kind of that moment in your life.
Great, thank you all. So this is what I do today, but this is not where I started. Like I told you earlier, I grew up in a community where if you went to school, you had to either become a medical doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And this was my parents' dream for me, that I become a medical doctor or an engineer. Lawyer was, but then there were some questions of whether or not I could survive as a lawyer, but they wanted me to become a doctor or an engineer. So they would say, I'm the mother of a doctor, I'm the father of an engineer, and so on and so forth. And so, the education system in Cameroon is such that when you get to high school, you decide whether or not you want to be in the sciences or the liberal arts, just history, literature, and stuff like that. And before I even got to high school, my parents had already made the decision for me. Never mind, they never saw the four walls of a classroom because none of them went to school, but they knew that they wanted me to become an engineer. But if you ask them what an engineer does, they wouldn't tell you. They just want to say that they are the parents of an engineer. And so I grew up hearing stories of successful medical doctors and engineers and how happy their lives were. And that's how I cultivated the notion that I would someday become a famous medical doctor and perform procedures on people and stuff like that. I remember once when I was listening to the radio with my father, he heard about a heart surgery that was done in South Africa. One of the first heart surgeries in the world was performed in South Africa. So he was hearing that story on the radio. He didn't go to school, but he understood English. I don't know how. I wish that could be done again today. And he told me that I want you to grow and be like this doctor who performed this heart surgery. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But somehow he didn't know that always having me by his side when he was listening to the radio was socializing me to the news business. Because instead of focusing on how to go to school, study, become a medical doctor and engineer, I was getting really interested in becoming that person whose voice was coming out of that little tiny radio that my father would always have on his ear, God rest his soul, and listen to the news, with that radio. So while I was in high school, I devoted much of my time not to learning how to perform experiments in laboratories or, design projects in physics labs or electricity, whatever those things are. I was in science class, no doubt. But I spent most of my time in the press club, in the debate club, in the choir. You'll be surprised today. In the choir as well, because these are the kinds of things that fascinated me. And, today I teach and I tell my students often that you can be a lot of things. You may think that you're in college because your parents want you to get a college degree, but if you don't think about what your passion is, they may want you to become a business person or to study management or to study computer science, but if you don't think about what your passion is and how you can turn that passion to make the story of your life, you're just studying to get a degree for your parents. And so I spent most of my time in high school doing these things. I didn't know that I was building a portfolio for myself or, engaging in these activities. And when I graduated high school, my oldest brother, God rest his soul too, he said, you have to go to the university and study mathematics and computer sciences. I was devastated because in high school, I was already exposed to communication a lot. I was working for non-governmental organizations as a high schooler and actual work and earning a salary, which was something very strange, not only in my community, but in Cameroon, because it's a country that's set up differently from, the United States, where high schoolers can get jobs here, and earn a salary. But this work with these non-governmental organizations was communication of community development and children's rights issues. That is how I found my voice. I knew right from that time that, I would excel in communication, in telling stories, in uplifting communities, in making an impact. Because some people may say, well, journalists are just those people who sit on TV, and by the way, I didn't do TV. I don't think that I have the face for TV. I don't plan on doing it. I was a radio person. That they just sit there and talk about what is going on. But right from high school, I saw the impact that communicating about development issues did in my community, the change that it brought. That is how I found my love for communication and journalism. And so I went on to college, University of Boya. I studied computer sciences and mathematics. I don't like to talk about that oftentimes and I never mention it. I studied computer science and mathematics, but whenever I sat in class and professors would be writing equations and writing codes, everything I saw was me on the radio reporting that this is happening, was me out there asking somebody why we don't have a street light here and stuff like that, and why we don't have A, B, C, D. And so I left mathematics and computer sciences and started again, went back to the School of Journalism. And it was tough getting into the School of Journalism because there are certain subjects that you need to have before you're admitted into the School of Journalism in Cameroon. But thanks to my previous background, already working for the national radio station as a high schooler and stuff like that, I was able to get admission there. And that's how I studied journalism, graduated, worked a couple years, and while I was in school, it was like a full-time job for me because I was working for local radio stations, hosting politics and culture shows, and stuff like that. And quiz shows too, because I like to, and I tell people this, someday I'm gonna be on Jeopardy. That's how I discovered that stories have power. And how we tell them, how many we tell, the way that we tell them and the characters that we have in those stories and about whom we tell these stories. And ever since then, it's been about these kinds of stories for me. Today, I may be telling the stories in a classroom in front of students or in the form of research papers, but they're still stories.
Isn't he great? Wonderful, Pechulano. Tell us a little bit more and really have us to really bring us into your mind why stories are important. Like why is it important for us to read a newspaper? Why is it important to listen to the radio? Why is it important that people are informed about anything in your viewpoint?
That's quite a question.
Yeah.
And we could take the whole of the rest of this week and talk about why stories are important. But let me do the best that I can to tell you why stories are important. So when you are a child and you're growing up, there are things that you learn from your parents in your home, right? You learn those things from stories, but you may not see them as stories because your life is a story. But let's get away from your home a little bit and think of through what window you see the world. Why it's important for you to read the newspaper, to listen to stories, to sit here and listen to me is because this platform that I have, or the news media, or the newspaper, or the radio, or television, or movies, or social media, all these are a window to the world. And depending on how open that window is, and depending on how much light goes through that window, that's how we see the world. That's why it's important to think about stories. That's why it's important to read about different places. That's why it's important to listen to one another. Now, let me deviate a little bit.
Sure.
We want to learn about each other. We want to live in peace. We want to have relationships with people. But unfortunately, in today's world, we tiptoe around each other because we're afraid to hurt feelings, because we're afraid to say something that will offend somebody. Essentially, we're afraid to hear each and everyone's story. And we're sacrificing, perspective. We're sacrificing understanding on the altar of convenience. Now, if that doesn't tell us how important stories are in just understanding, then you have to take the next class to learn about this. I'm sorry.
Beautiful. All right. So you've told us a little bit about your home in Cameroon. So you hopped on a plane and you came to these United States. Michigan, right?
Yes.
Tell us all.
I'm going to tell you that I'm happy that WIU is not an opponent of Michigan State in football because that will always be home. For those of you who have been to Michigan State, once you are a Spartan, you are always a Spartan. There's nothing that's going to change that. So I came here late 2014, and Michigan was my first home. I went to Michigan State, and in pursuit of my goal to tell stories in their very many shades, and I started engaging, in the community, working for, the various NPR stations in Michigan, because...
Sorry, is that you?
That is me.
No.
I know. That is me. So, when I moved to Michigan, I told myself that I had set out to tell stories, regardless of where I am. There's always a story that I think that I should be telling. And so when I got to Michigan, the first thing I did was got in touch with, the different radio stations that were there, the ones that were on campus, the ones that were in town, and see how I could be engaged. And one project that I worked on, while I was at Michigan State that's still so very close to my heart today was, a podcast that I used to host called The Food Fix. Essentially, it was me talking to researchers and innovators and policymakers on how to better feed the world, on how to solve world hunger. Don't ask me if we found a solution. I know that we talked about viable solutions on the show itself. And so when I think of, the continuation of telling stories in this country from Cameroon, Michigan is always going to be the place that I go back to because it was a community that opened their arms to me, and were willing to listen like you guys are today to me, bring perspective to the table, because some guy with an African accent coming and then you're putting them on radio, it's usually not easy and stuff like that. So I found that fascinating and continued to build a voice in the community. But something that I also did while I was in Michigan, for Michigan Public Radio, that I really loved was working on most of the stories of the Flint water crisis, because I was there when this was happening. And when I started working for Michigan Public Radio, I was like, I want to devote my time to telling these kinds of stories, because Flint is a community like mine, like where I grew up. And so when I find myself in those settings, it's almost like it's a responsibility to pay it forward. Because oftentimes people who are in these places, today researchers call them living in news deserts, because there are no journalists or newspapers or news organizations there that tell their stories. But we can train ourselves to be the storytellers, regardless of how you're telling that story, whether it's through music, whether it's through theater. It's about community building.
Michigan sounds like a great place.
It does, until when the winter comes. Because the winter is brutal. That's one thing that I don't like,
Yeah. I'm a Georgia boy that moved to Nebraska, and then I moved to Macomb, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Now, segue us to you decided to go back to, is MSU in the Big Ten?
Yes,
it is a Big Ten. So you left
one,
you graduated from one Big Ten school and then
went to another Big Ten. Yes.
Penn State.
Yes. And I get to answer the question a lot of times, why did you go to Penn State? So my journey of telling stories and, traveling to quite a number of countries on the continent of Africa and listening to people, took me to Penn State because it had something that I was looking for. I was looking to tell stories from a different perspective. So I had just been, talking about people who are going through some difficulty in their communities, people who are going through challenges and stuff like that. And by the way, I say here that don't let fear stop you. Remember when I told you that I have not done TV? I lied. I have, but I don't plan on doing it. But I never thought I could do TV until I am in Toronto once, and they say, well, you're visiting and we're doing this show. Since you're a journalist, why don't you do this for us? And I'm like, that doesn't seem like it's possible, but let's see how it goes. But essentially, this is one of the reasons why I went to Penn State, because I wanted to tell stories from the perspective of, international and global issues. And Penn State offered me an opportunity to do that because they had degrees that allowed me to blend knowledge from different places. And so this trip, I was in Toronto on a business meeting with international NGOs, talking about how to use impact storytelling for resource mobilization. For example, what's happening now, between Russia and Ukraine. Let's not talk about that. And the number of refugees who are moving from their country to different countries in Eastern Europe and stuff like that. How do we use the stories of their migration to mobilize resources? That's what brought me here, and that's what Penn State was able to give me. And it was not just that, but also having the opportunity to go deep into the communities. And here I am in one of the refugee camps in East Cameroon, just the border between Central African Republic and Cameroon, documenting the lives of the refugees who have fled war from Central African Republic to Cameroon, telling their stories. And one of the things that, really fascinated me about this particular trip, which is something that I would not have known if I didn't take up the opportunity to attend Penn State and learn both mass communication and international development policy, is knowing exactly how the dollar that you would see an ad on Facebook or on Twitter saying donate so we can help this kid who is suffering, who's living in a refugee camp, and knowing how that dollar trickles right down to the refugee kid in the refugee camp. This is what, my skills from learning communication in the context of international development policy led me to do. And one thing that I found fascinating about this trip was I sat down, I was listening to the story of this boy. He was 12 then, and when war broke out in Central African Republic in 2014, he got separated from his parents when he was just 10. And he lived in another refugee camp in Chad for 2 years alone, until he woke up one day and said he was going to the country where he heard his parents were to look for them. As I sat here listening to this boy, my whole life flashed in front of me, like how privileged we are, and how oftentimes we don't think about where we are, what we have, and how we can leverage what we have to make a better society. Because this is a 12-year-old kid who decides to make a journey that is more than 1,000 miles on foot to see the parents who had been separated from war. Granted, war's happening, lots going on around the world, but I set out to know whether or not when you give out that $1 and say, I'm giving this in the name of that kid who is sitting in a refugee camp, whether or not they get it. And I think these stories are equally valid. They are the perspective that we need. They're the perspective that we need for a story to be complete.
Wow.
Did I say too much?
No. That's beautiful, and I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I'm just going to keep going. But with all that you've given us and have given some perspective now here in Macomb, as the inaugural CT Vivian class. I like that word, inaugural. What does this mean? What does it all mean? And in perspective to what you're teaching your students, to how you go forth, are going to go forth in teaching and presenting and researching, and what is it that you hope to not only to accomplish but to give, and for this particular community, for the more developing community of color, and for future students to Macomb? What can students expect when they roll into a soon-to-be Dr. Pechulano Ali's course in communication?
And if some of them are here today, they will tell you that I talk about some of these things in class a lot. But, like I said, that I am on a journey. I don't know where that journey is going to take me next, or when it's going to end, and how much it's going to develop in the town of Macomb at Western Illinois University. But even if I'm here for a day and I teach for a day or have a conversation with somebody for a day, I want to make sure that I see a story that I can tell in that person, and I tell it in a way. And so in the classroom, I tell my students that, again, the news media, platforms is your window to the world. It's very important to learn about McDonough County, the city of Macomb, the state of Illinois, the Midwest, the United States. But there's never been a time in history, I believe, that perspective is very important in handling the challenges, in confronting the challenges that present themselves to us today. So, as those platforms, the media or whatever that you may be getting it, wherever you may be getting information from, is your window to the world, make sure that window is wide, as wide as the world itself. Because while it's important to learn about, your community, where you grew up and stuff like that, you're not going to be able to survive in the world out there if you don't know what is going on in that world. Even if you say, yeah, it's happening in Russia and Ukraine, it doesn't concern me. The next morning, your gas prices are up. You can't get some basic commodities that you were supposed to get because those things came from those parts of the world. And so I tell my students that we are here to learn from each other and connect the dots. Why is this happening? How is it related to us? What can we learn from it? And as it relates to being the inaugural class of, the C.T. Vivian Scholar, when I accepted the job, it was like, and I looked at it first, and I looked at the profile of the person on whose behalf the position is endowed, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is exactly like me, because Dr. C.T. Vivian was, a community builder. And he was also somewhat a journalist. He was the editor of this student newspaper. Here on campus, he was in the business of telling stories, and his life had been, until his passing, about using that platform, using his voice as a storyteller to build communities. Now, he did that differently from what I'm doing right now. He did it by going outside, mobilizing, talking to people, organizing, talking about equality, talking about fairness for different groups of people, and advocating for those who felt like, or those who still feel like they're not treated equally. But I'm doing it in the classroom because I see the classroom as a platform for me. And one thing that really fascinates me is knowing that I'm not only in the business of telling stories, but I'm in the business of molding people who will be presidents tomorrow, who will be sitting in places tomorrow and making decisions about this world. And, oftentimes I tell some of my students when they come into office hours or having conversations or talking to colleagues, I say, look, a lot of things happen in the world today, and we say, I don't want to talk about politics because I'm afraid that, it's going to get people offended because we don't know what we'll say. I don't want to talk about culture because I don't know what I would say. But unfortunately for me, as a communications educator, I teach politics. I teach culture. I teach economics. I teach whatever you can think of. I teach art. Because a student will tell you that I will take a class in economics to know how demand and supply works, or they'll tell you that I'll take a class in political science to know how the political system works. But those political science classes and economics classes will not tell that student how to weave history, how to weave economic aspects into their stories, and put human faces into those economic activities or those political issues that affect people. Stories are about people. And the moment that we take how, whatever's going on around the world, we take away that from a story, we're just talking. We are not considering how those things affect people. The human face is what I often tell my students. If you're telling me a story and you're focusing on the place that the story is happening at, and you're not telling me about who whatever event is affecting and how it's affecting them and why it's affecting them, and why for me is a very important question, because it answers a lot of questions that we may have. I tell you, well, as a journalist, as a budding journalist, you have to always think of, why is this happening? Now, I have to tell you, students don't like to ask the why question because they're interested in, oh, this is how it works, but why does it work like this? It's in the moment that we teach them, and I do this in my classes a lot, you have to ask why it is happening, because that is how you learn about a different culture. That is how you learn about a different way of life. That is how you learn about somebody else's story. And that is how you build a story that is completely representative of the people. There is a famous video that I use in my classes, and if some of my students are here today, they will tell you that, yeah, I've taken 2 classes with him and he's shown this video. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. It's by famous Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, and it's one of the most viewed TED Talks in the world today. She gave it, I think it was in 2009, about how dangerous it is to have just a single story and how vulnerable we are in the face of a story. Now, to remedy our vulnerability, we need to always ask the question, why? We need to always be patient to listen. We need to always be willing, to hear the other side. Like I said, today we want to do everything in peace. I hear in America, oh, there is a lot of divisions. People are doing this. No one wants to listen. That is because we are tiptoeing around each other. That's because we're afraid to talk to each other. That's because we're afraid to listen respectfully to each other. And know that while we're different, there's one thing that unites us. We're just humans, and we just have different ways of doing things. This is one thing that I try to tell my students, that if you take my class and you leave without understanding that there is always another side which is equally important to what you believe and which is equally relevant, considering history, considering politics, considering culture and social issues, then you did not take my class.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, Pechulano Ali.
Thank you.
Is there anything you would like to leave us with? Words or story, anything?
So, I don't want to leave you with anything. I want you to ask me what you want to know.
Great. So I guess we can open the floor for questions. I don't have a handheld mic or anything, but I will do my best to
and even if it's that teeny tiny question that you've always wanted to ask me, this is the rarest opportunity that you have. Yes.
So obviously there's great power in a good story. How do you get those stories told? And I mean, how do you choose, with all the background knowledge and all the competing stories, and all the competing interests that sort of exist in the reality, how as a journalist or how as an advocate, how do you get that story focused out of the background noise so that people
That's a great question. You should have told me that it was going to be a difficult question so I could prepare. Come on. Oh, you know, I have to be honest with you. I struggle with that on a daily basis. And my students and I struggle with that in class as well. But this is what I tell them. If there is anything that will help us distinguish between a story, whether or not that story is real, whether or not it's worth telling, it's learning how to think critically. Now, I say that because of the need to, be convenient wherever we find ourselves. We don't want to ask the question. We don't want to question why things happen. We don't want to question whether or not things are even true. Somebody says something to you or a story is published tomorrow because you grew up in a family where, for example, they would only talk about, well, this president is bad, that president is good. If people think like this, they are bad. If people support this person, they're good, and stuff like that. If you do not question, in which case, if you do not try to think about it critically and consider both sides, in which case, look at what evidence is available. What does history tell us about why things happen the way that they do? What can we learn from that? How can we bring it in, that perspective or those perspectives, into this scenario? Then it's going to continuously be difficult for us to distinguish whether or not a story is even valid to be told, or whether we should even believe what is told about, different places. I give you an example. Imagine that I come into Macomb and I want to tell the story of WIU, and I say, oh, WIU is a university that sits in the middle of cornfields in a small town in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest with very cold winter, and I leave. That's what you know, right? Our window to the world becomes that story. That is what I have conditioned you to think. That's what, when you read about Macomb, just Google Macomb or Google WIU, what would you see? But if I come here and I decide to tell that story, including the fact that WIU, is the university that produced one of the most iconic civil rights activists of modern world, that it's produced congressmen, that it's produced people who've gone on to do great things, that it's produced actors and actresses, musicians, and so on and so forth. It's that process of thinking analytically and critically that allows us to be able to separate from the noise out there, that allows us to also cut through that noise as storytellers. Because if there's a lot of noise out there, you have to be different if you are telling stories. Now, there's something today, debate about objectivity and all those kinds of things. That's also important, to be neutral. But we also have to understand that issues like that are a luxury to those who have not been systemically oppressed, for example. Because if I'm telling a story about my English-speaking region, part of Cameroon, the way that I tell it is different because there's a history to that. If I'm telling a story about the plight of Black people in America, that would be different because there's a history to that. And until we acknowledge that and begin to think about that, from a distance from our comfort zone, I don't think that we can separate from or cut through that noise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, a very easy one, please. Tammy.
How does your mom feel about the fact that you have become a journalist instead of a doctor? Because I'm really, really concerned about that.
I think
You should. And she was. But when I decided to pursue journalism, none of my family members knew until my graduation. Yes. Yes, because it was tough for them to accept because they were responsible for my education. But I told one of my brothers, who passed, he was my benefactor, he passed in 2013, God rest his soul. I told him that I didn't want to do mathematics and computer sciences. And who knows, I could have been a very rich tech guy today if I did that. And he said that was all between him and I. So I had to be responsible for my education in journalism school because they didn't want to hear it. But they were concerned. They just say, well, do what you want to do. We don't care about you anymore. But when it was graduation from journalism school, hey, I'm graduating, I'm wearing a gown, come celebrate with me. But I have to tell you that in the midst of all these things, my mother is my pivot. She is the reason I'm here today. She is the reason I have whatever I have. She's the reason I do whatever I do, because growing up and seeing how she worked to make sure that I become somebody, my brothers become, people, become what they wanted to be, pursue their dreams and stuff like that, inspired me a lot. And I'm sure that a lot of us can say the same about our mothers. Mothers are just like that.
Aren't they great?
Today when she thinks about where I am, she's like, yeah, I didn't go to school, but keep going. You're going to go to that school plus the one that I had to go. She's just happy that I am doing what I love and, excelling at it. Don't be concerned anymore. Are there any more questions? You can ask questions. I don't have office hours this week, so. Charlie.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned was the importance of teaching students to think critically. And this is something that I know we've talked about a little bit before, but this is something I've been hearing for basically my whole life. In elementary school, and middle school, and high school, all my teachers were always saying this statement that we want to teach our students to think critically. And maybe you've already really said all that needs to be said. You mentioned that you just need to make students ask the why question. Why are things the way they are? But I'm wondering if you have any more insight on how, in your classes and in all the other classes, particularly, in music classes, how can we help encourage students to think critically?
Mm-hmm. Great. And I'm going to answer that question starting with Alfonso's presentation or recital.
Recital.
My God, I always keep getting this recital. So if any of you were in here when Alfonso was doing his recital, it was, I too can sing. Songs of the darker
brother.
The darker brothers. Now, just looking at that, there is a message in it, right? And that's music. Then look at the kinds of musicians that whose music Alfonso decided to perform. There's also a story to that. So whether you are teaching music, economics, politics, art, theater, whatever, there is a history behind that. There is a way that it connects to politics. There's a way that it connects to economics. There's a way that it connects to culture. There's a way that it connects to representation, representing different people. And so if we learn how to connect this dot, to me that is critical thinking. Because that recital, I used it as an example in one of my classes, and I talked to my students and said, look, somebody may say, but why is this faculty member performing just this? I said, but go back and look at recitals historically, what kind of musicians have been represented on stage. When we start thinking like that, instead of just thinking about it superficially, well, it's a recital, yeah, we have to come and stand and listen to him sing songs and do stuff. How does it affect people who look like Alfonso, who look like me, people who look like Q? How does it affect people who don't look like me? How does it affect people who are in distant places? Now, here's another quick example, and I mentioned this, with a student during office hours today when they came to see me, and I said, think of what is happening in Eastern Europe now. How does it affect America? How does it affect you who is here? Now, the student may or may not know that, Russia produces a lot of gas, right? That we all need in the world, in cars and stuff to work. When this war keeps going on, what's going to happen? BP's making a statement, they're pulling out, all these companies are doing it, which is great. But how is it going to affect us? Now, if we sit at our corners and just say, well, it's Russia and Ukraine, it's happening that way, we shouldn't care about it. Or the sentiments that we have against Russia or Russians in this country, if we just look at those superficially without looking at how something fundamentally, I was following a thread on Twitter where it was actually a congresswoman who was, blasting, all the help that the world is galvanizing for this particular country. Like, why should people even care? And I'm like, my God, you don't even understand what is going on. The next moment we're hearing threats of, I have a nuclear team on standby. That is going to affect us. So it's stretching your neck beyond your comfort zone and looking for that point of view that is very different from yours. So in music, the kinds of musicians, saxophone, right? The kinds of, artists that do saxophone, how can we think about them? Do we have just a particular group of people who do it, or historically, have they done it in one particular way? Is there another way that we can do it? Are there particular, arrangements that people do, or why aren't arrangements? And I was having this conversation with a student who's actually, I think they're doing music and business, and I met them because they wanted to take my class and I wanted to see if it was good for them. And I was asking them, why are you doing music? And they seem to be very interested in writing songs, but songs that relate to their roots. They are Black, they are African American, songs that relate to their roots and stuff like that. So if we don't listen to the why when we ask, right? Or we just ask because it's our role as instructors to ask, that. We ask, listen, guide. That's how I see critical and analytical thinking playing in class, stretching beyond our point and listening to students and hearing the perspectives that they have. Now, those perspectives must not always or may not always be, okay, it's our role. And this is what I often do in my class and say, well, I'm here to guide you. That's it. And this is how I can guide you. If you don't answer this question, you'd have to think about it because it leaves a big hole. And oftentimes the students would see, yeah, that makes sense. Does that make sense? Thank you. Is there anyone else with another?
How are we doing?
Great. Thank you for coming. Oh. Thank you.